Thebes had fallen. The once great city, home to legendary heroes like Heracles, now lay in ruins, the result of a brutal 3-year siege by a coalition of rival Greek states. And yet some say that if it hadn't been for this disaster, Greece would have never given birth to one of its greatest heroes, the unmatched Epaminondas. But how did Thebes fall? How did Epaminondas rise? And why do some say the Oracle of Delphi herself was to blame? Thebes is situated about 60 miles or 100 kilometers northwest of Athens in a region known as Boeotia. And it was here at the base of the Citaran Mountains that two royal families, the Cadmids and the Amphicals, fought for control of the throne. As you can imagine, this civil war wasn't going to well for anyone. So in 376 BC, the warring factions agreed to a truce and asked the Oracle of Delphi who should rule. And her answer surprised them all. She said that neither family line was cursed, but that a new hero from the house of Amasis would unite the city and lead it to glory. Now, whoever ends up being that hero isn't born yet, so both families decided to keep fighting until he was. Now, to be fair, they weren't just fighting over who would make the best lasagna. They were fighting over who would make the most powerful lasagna. See, Thebes was in an extremely strategic location with easy access to the important trade routes between northern and southern Greece, not to mention right next door to the powerful city of Athens. So whichever family won this war would end up controlling a huge chunk of central Greece, which is why both families kept fighting even after the oracle's prophecy. But then something unexpected happened. The Amphicals won. Their leader, the ambitious King Cypselus, forced the Cadmids into exile and he united the city under his rule. At least that's what history remembers. What really happened was that the oracle manipulated the situation to get exactly what she wanted. You see, there was no prophecy that a new hero from the house of Amasis would unite Thebes. That was something the oracle just made up on the spot. The truth was she had sent her agents years ago to find a suitable candidate. She watched over him as he grew up, training him secretly, making sure he was strong and brave enough to become the hero she needed. His name was Epaminondas. And let me tell you, he was perfect. I mean, we're talking demigod level perfect. Unfortunately, though, he didn't know any of that. He was still just a simple farmer, far from the great hero Greece would come to know. In 360 BC, Cyrus led his army into battle against the Athenians. The outcome was a decisive Theban victory. And then something strange happened. Cyrus fell gravely wounded on the battlefield and sent word back to Thebes that he needed someone to replace him as commander. While the other nobles argued over who should take command, Epaminondas volunteered for the job. And when the enemy saw who it was leading the Theban army, their morale collapsed and they fled the field. Not only had Epaminondas won the battle, he had done it without even drawing his sword. From there, Epaminondas became commander-in-chief of the Theban army. And in 361 BC, he assembled a force of 15,000 hoplites and marched on Athens. The Athenians were confident in their victory, boasting, one day more and Athens would be filled with Theban women. But Epaminondas and his friend Polynices snuck into the city disguised as herders, set fire to the Athenian fleet, then returned to the mainland with the supplies they looted. The next day, when the Athenians realized their navy was gone, they sued for peace and soon Thebes was master of central Greece. The oracle's plan was working perfectly. By getting rid of Cyrus, she had placed Epaminondas in charge, and he was uniting Greece under the banner of Thebes just as she had instructed. All she had to do now was make sure everyone knew it was her doing. After consolidating his power, Epaminondas turned his attention to the Spartans, who had recently kicked off the war that would become known as the Peloponnesian War. In 369 BC, the Spartans defeated the Thebans at the Battle of Leuctra. But before that defeat, Epaminondas had gone to Delphi and asked the oracle for advice on how to defeat Sparta. And she told him to sacrifice the traitorous Cyrus there at the altar of Zeus. Now, even though everyone knew Cyrus had started the sacred war against the oracle's wishes, executing him was a big deal. But Epaminondas figured if it was good enough for the oracle, it was good enough for him. And after sacrificing Cyrus, he went out and defeated Sparta at Leuctra. Now, in addition to becoming the most powerful military leader in Greece, Epaminondas also became the most popular. Ordinary folk loved him, the elite hated him. They accused him of being a tyrant, a demagogue, and even a Spartan spy. In fact, they got so bad that eventually the Council of Elders took away his command. But Epaminondas kept winning victories, and soon the people of Thebes turned on the elite, forcing them to restore Epaminondas' command. And from there, Epaminondas went on to crush the Spartans once again at the Battle of Mantinea in 361 BC. But while he was winning battles, he was losing friends. Polynices was killed in Mantinea, and soon after Epaminondas was mortally wounded in a skirmish against the Macedonians. When his fellow Thebans arrived carrying his shield to the temple of the oracle, she greeted them with tears, saying, "You are too late. Another has come instead of you." And when they asked who, she said, "Philip of Macedon." And just like that, the oracle of Delphi passed the torch to Philip. Now if you don't know anything about Philip, let me catch you up real quick. Back when Epaminondas was taking over central Greece, Philip was busy taking over the entire north. He defeated the Thracians, subjugated the Scythians, and then he turned his attention to the Persian king Artaxerxes II. Philip defeated the Persians at the Battle of the River Granicus in 334 BC, then followed them all the way to the Oracle of Susa to claim the title of new Cyrus. Now, if you've seen my video on Alexander the Great, you'll know that after Philip was murdered by his son Alexander, the Oracle of Delphi quickly switched sides and helped Alexander on his way to world domination. But not everyone believed the oracle. When Philip came to Delphi, he challenged her, demanding she prove she was the true oracle of Apollo by predicting what would happen if he sacrificed his son. Then when she refused and told him he should not sacrifice his son, he did it anyway. Now, whether or not the oracle spoke truly is up for debate, but what is that she continued to speak through the third person long after she accepted Alexander as her champion. For example, at one point she told Alexander to sacrifice his general Ptolemy, which he did. But when Ptolemy's ghost appeared and told Alexander the oracle was lying, he stopped sacrificing people. So you can probably imagine how the people of Thebes felt when she told them another hero had replaced Epaminondas. Some thought she was lying, just like Ptolemy. Others thought she was speaking through the third person again. And maybe that's what happened. Maybe the oracle was trying to send Philip to finish what Epaminondas started. But either way, the people of Thebes weren't having it. They wanted Epaminondas to be their champion. So they begged the oracle to clarify what she meant. But when she told them Philip was the new Cyrus, they tried to kill her. When word reached Philip, he put down his Persian campaign and marched on Delphi. The Phocians tried to stop him, but he easily defeated them and seized control of the sanctuary. From there, he left a garrison to protect the oracle and headed south. Meanwhile, the Thebans were regretting their decision, realizing they'd made a huge mistake. They sent messengers after Philip begging him to return to Delphi, offering him anything he wanted. But Philip didn't forgive them. He raised the siege of Mantinea and marched straight on Thebes. Now, when Philip laid siege to Thebes, the Thebans remembered how the oracle had failed to save them in the past. But maybe she was trying to make up for it because when the Thebans were on the brink of starvation, she suddenly inspired the Theban women to raid the nearby mountains, where they found so much food that the siege was lifted. Philip was furious and laid siege to Delphi. But before he could finish the job, he got word that the Persian king had invaded Thrace. So, he broke the siege and went back north. This time, the oracle told him not to worry because the Persian king wouldn't make it past the river Alpheus. And just like she predicted, the Persian army lost the Battle of Chauronia and retreated back to Persia. Now, even though she had saved Greece from the Persians, the people of Delphi blamed her for everything that had happened since Philip took control. And finally, she had had enough. She broke her silence and spoke to them directly, saying, "It was I who set up my shrine here and chose Phoebus Apollo as my father. It was I who prophesied the Theban victories and brought the Spartans to ruin. Yet you dared to say that I am a liar, yes, and to plot evil against me. Know this, henceforth, no man will ever again receive clear answers from me by night or by day. You shall only hear unintelligible sounds mixed together. And just like that, the golden age of prophecy came to an end. As for Epaminondas, the oracle was actually wrong about him. After he died, the people of Thebes buried him next to Polynices. And historians remember him as the greatest Theban hero of all. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that thumbs up button. This is my weekly content on ancient history. This week we are discussing Lydgate's Siege of Thebes *. In this series, I normally cover episodes of classic works that have some sort of connection to ancient Greece or Rome. But if you haven't noticed, the last few videos have not really been in that vein. We covered 3 episodes of an Icelandic saga, then 4 episodes of the Song of Roland *, and now we're moving on to a 15th century English poem about the Theban army. So what gives? Well, there are 2 answers. 1, it's medieval, so it must be related to Europe, right? And 2, the Siege of Thebes * is actually quite fun. It's very easy to find modern retellings of the story of the Theban army that emphasize its homoerotic subtext. A quick Google search will turn up a number of such works. However, this video is rated for all audiences, so we won't be looking at those today. That being said, though, the poem is definitely worth reading even without that particular lens. Lydiard's language is playful and energetic. His descriptions are vivid. His characters are memorable. And he takes a great deal of pleasure in describing martial prowess of all kinds. Whether it's Eudipus and Polynices fighting over the throne or a bunch of kids playing a game or a detachment of the Ben cavalry routing a Persian infantry force. If you'd like to read the poem along with us, a good edition is available online for free at archive.org. And if you want to listen to it, a recording is available on Spotify and other platforms. For the rest of this series, I'll provide chapter titles, but no episode division since the poem follows a narrative structure. Here are the chapters, and if you'd like to skip ahead to one of them, feel free. The poem opens with an invocation to Apollo, who was worshipped at the sanctuary of the 7 gates in Thebes. The first chapter introduces us to the city of Thebes. Lydgate describes how the 7 gates were originally built by the legendary figures Cadmus and his son-in-law Amphion. Then after they died, Echion, son of Zeus and king of the city, had the gates fortified. They're a symbol of the strength of the city and of the Theban identity. Later on, we'll see how this identity is something that needs to be recovered by the Thebans because of their intermarriage with the Persians. Chapter 2 tells how the Thebans were once threatened by a neighboring people called the Ethiopians. Now exactly who these guys are is a little tricky. The Ethiopians in Greek mythology are usually a people of northeastern Africa. And while there was certainly a group of people known as the Ethiopians in Greek and Roman literature, I think Lydgate may have conflated the name of that people with the region itself. Anyway, King Echion sent out champions to scout the Ethiopian army and soon found himself locked in single combat with their champion named Ormenus. The 2 fight and each wound the other before deciding to call a truce and be friends. This isn't really the most original plotline, but Lydgate makes it pretty entertaining. After they made peace, Echion invited Ormus and his men to stay in Thebes and intermarry with the locals. In fact, this is the beginning of the Theban tradition of taking foreign mercenaries into the city to bolster its population. And the most famous example of this is, of course, the 150 pairs of lovers that make up the Theban army. Speaking of whom, chapter 3 begins with the marriage of Eudipus and his beloved Polynices. Now, Oedipus is the elder twin and thus should become king when their father, King Menelaus, dies. However, the 2 boys pledge to rule together as joint monarchs. And when the time comes, Polynices wants to honor that oath. Unfortunately, Oedipus doesn't see things the same way. He claims that only the eldest can be king. And so he takes the throne and refuses to share it with his brother. Polynices isn't going to stand for this, so he raises an army and lays siege to the city. Now, we know that this is a doomed enterprise, and we also know that the Thebans ultimately win the war, but that's not how Lydgate frames the story. In his telling, it's Polynices who wins the siege, but we'll get there. In the meantime, Chapter 4 details the arrival of 200 pairs of foreign mercenaries in Thebes. Lydgate describes how they came from various places around the Black Sea, from Chimuria and Scythia and Armenia. To name a few, they were hired by the Theban elders, probably as a stopgap measure against the ongoing siege. These guys aren't around for the long haul, but they do arrive just in time to reinforce the Theban side in the massive battle that kicks off Chapter 5. On one side stands the Theban army, comprising the elite 150 pairs of lovers, some troops brought in from other city-states, and the recently arrived mercenaries. On the other side is the invading force led by Polynices and his 7 generals. Now, for the opposing forces, the main point of interest is their generals, who are probably supposed to be the 7 generals of the invading army mentioned in Plutarch's * on the education of children *. Those generals are Adrastus, Polynices, Tydeus, Coponius, Hippomedon, Deianira and Oedipus. But Lydgate mentions only 6 here. Let's go through them and see if we can figure out who he left out. First is Adrastus, who is described as the noblest of the 7 captains, which sounds a lot like the role that Adrastus has in Plutarch's story. Then we have Polynices, who is specifically referred to as the siege captain. Finally, we have Coponius, Tydeus, Hippomedon and Diomed, all of whom are identified by their shields. Now, Coponius is apparently such a hotshot that he carries a tower shield that reaches all the way to the ground. There's no way that this guy could move very well in such cumbersome armor, but his shield certainly would offer him excellent protection. Then Tydeus is armed with a buckler and a spear. Tydeus is actually killed during the battle. The shield that he's carrying is picked up by the Theban warrior named Cyrus, who will later be slain by another warrior named Chilon. Hippomedon, on the other hand, is armed with a kite shield and a sword. He is eventually killed by Epaminondas, one of the Theban captains. And finally, we have Diomed, who is armed with a targe and a spear and is killed by another Theban captain named Plistarchus. That leaves us with Adrastus, who according to Lydgate's account isn't killed in the battle. So perhaps he's the one that was left out. Adrastus was also one of the 7 generals in Plutarch's story, and he is the one who survives the entire episode. Now, as for the 150 pairs of lovers, the poet identifies only 18 of them, which might disappoint those of you who are hoping for more explicit homoerotic themes. On the Theban side, we have Adrastus and Oedipus, Coponius and Promachus, Tydeus and Coral, Hippomedon and Medius, Deianira and Aphareus, Polynices and Aristeus, Menetius and Epaminondas, and lastly, Eteocles and his unnamed younger brother. And on the opposing side, we have Melanippus and Pirithous, Cletus and Archelaus, Nicias and Pamines, Opither and Alcibiades, Virsander and Onias, Thos and Mines, Ismenes and Clitophon, and Lysimachus and Phoebus. Some of these pairings are taken directly from Plutarch's list, but others clearly aren't. Okay, enough about the characters. What happens in this battle? Basically, everyone fights everyone. And in the end, the Thebans come out on top. It is a hard-fought victory, though, and many of the Theban warriors are wounded or killed, including the aforementioned Cyrus, Chilon, Epaminondas, and Plistarchus. In Chapter 6, the Theban women hear about all the carnage and mourn for their fallen men. In response to this, the god Apollo decides to help the Thebans win the next battle. Before that happens, though, there is a nice scene in Chapter 7 where the surviving Theban champions discuss how they might break the siege. In the end, they decide to send a contingent of 200 horsemen to relieve the garrison in the northwest tower. And the Theban princess, who has fallen in love with one of the captains, volunteers to go with them. The plan works and the Theban cavalry gets away safely. And now, Chapter 8, Apollo has blessed the Theban army with golden armor, so their chances of winning the next battle are even better. They face off against the enemy, and the result is decisive. The Theban cavalry annihilates the opposing horse. And the infantrymen don't fare much better either. In fact, only 2 of the generals manage to escape alive. In Chapter 9, the Theban army marches out of the city to do battle against the Chian League, who are apparently besieging the city of Orchomenus. The Thebans are accompanied by 200 Persian mercenaries that they picked up earlier. The two armies face off, and the Thebans charge straight into the thick of battle. The Persians stay back and form a protective circle around the Theban champions. In the midst of the fray, Cyrus and Chilon, who remember being killed in the previous battle, return to the fight. They slay the Persian general who was leading the cavalry and then pursue him as he flees to his chariot. The driver of the chariot is killed, so the general jumps down and runs away on foot. Meanwhile, Ismenes is having a fierce duel with the Chian champion, but the latter eventually tires and runs away. In the end, the Thebans achieve another resounding victory. Chapter 10 details the aftermath of the battle. Ismenes and his companion Clitophon decide to retire from the fighting. Cyrus and Chilon pursue the defeated Achaean champion and bring him back to Thebes. The princess has fallen in love with one of the Theban captains, but since she's engaged to the Spartan king, her suitor must remain hidden. As a last resort, he writes his feelings for her on a wall, but unfortunately she never sees the inscription. That's all I have to cover for this week. Next time we'll continue with Chapter 11, where the princess takes matters into her own hands. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and consider supporting me on a crowdfunding platform. I'll put the link in the description. If you want to keep watching, the next episode is available on the screen. Thanks for watching. Hello, it's me. It's time for another installment of the famous siege where the protagonist refuses to surrender despite having terrible odds because they have a giant on their side. Last week we talked about the Siege of Constantinople, which has a similar plot but is actually quite different from today's story. So if you missed last week's video, you might want to watch that one first or else this one won't make much sense. Also be warned, this video does contain some spoilers for an 800-year-old poem. Anyway, let's talk about the Siege of Thebes. This is the second video in a series on giant-themed stories. You can find more information below. Thebes is a city in Greece. Its location is not super important to the story, so all you really need to know is that it's surrounded by mountains and forests. The story starts with two rival armies approaching the city. One of them is led by a guy called Athelstane, who is described as a heathen, while the other is led by Lear, who is a Christian. Both of these guys have beef with the Theban king, who is called Theodoric, and they decide to team up in order to besiege the city. Now, the reason that Athelstane hates Theodoric is that Theodoric killed his son in battle. And the reason that Lear hates Theodoric is that Theodoric is having an affair with Lear's wife. So both of these guys are seeking revenge. And after hearing these names, you probably guessed that this story comes from a Norse source, right? Well, you'd be wrong. All of these characters are actually English. And if you're wondering why they have Scandinavian-sounding names, it's because this story comes from a poem called The Siege of Thebes, which was written in the 13th century by an English monk named John of Fordun. That's a mouthful. John of Fordun wrote this poem at the request of King Edward I of England. And that request came with a catch. John of Fordun could only use characters from English folklore, which is how he ended up writing about a siege that never happened. There is a version of this poem that claims to be based on actual events that took place in the 5th century. But the fact that it was written in the 13th century means that it went through a long process of transmission before being written down. And that usually means that the stories change a lot. The whole point of writing a history based on oral tradition is to present a legendary past to your audience. And what better way to do that than with a fun little poem about a siege that never happened? Kind of like how the Iliad says that Ajax was the best Greek warrior after Achilles, even though Homer was pretty clearly aware that that wasn't true. John of Fordun probably wanted to present his audience with a history of England that made the English look good. And the most effective way of doing that was to take existing folktales about famous English heroes and rework them into an epic poem that glorified the English kings of old. John of Fordun's poem presents us with a version of England where everyone is either a descendant of Alfred the Great or a friend of Arthur S. And even though this isn't very historically accurate, it makes for a pretty fun story. So let's get back to talking about it. When the armies of Athelstan and Lear arrive, the Thebans immediately send out a group of 40 knights to scout the situation. They come back and tell everyone that there is no way that they could win a battle against these guys, so they should just surrender. After hearing this, Theodoric wants to kill himself, but his wife stops him. She says that if he kills himself, then her reputation will be ruined forever, and she would prefer that they all die fighting. So instead, the gate to the city is locked and the drawbridge is raised. Now, Athelstan and Lear were hoping to sneak into the city at night, but the Thebans had set up lights around the walls so they couldn't do that. So instead, they spent 20 days constructing siege works and engines. Meanwhile, inside the city, Theodoric spends his time trying to kill the messenger who told him to surrender. When he finally catches the guy, he cuts off his head, supposedly without breaking his Arthurian oath that forbade him from killing anyone inside the city walls. And Theodoric throws the guy's head over the top of the wall to the people outside, along with a message saying, "If any one of you would come inside the town and kill me, he shall have this man's head." No one takes him up on this offer, though. Maybe they were scared of the Theban archers, or maybe they were just cowards. After 27 days, Athelstan and Lear decided to launch a full-scale assault on the city, but the Thebans fought them off. And then the two leaders got into an argument, and this argument almost ended the siege right there. Lori claimed that he was in charge, and Athelstan was lucky that he didn't get stabbed for being a pain in the ass. But after 20 minutes of shouting at each other, they settled down and agreed to keep working on the siege. At this point, the army of Athelstan is getting low on supplies, so he decides to send out 40 knights to forage for food. This goes poorly, though, and 39 of the knights get killed, which just leaves Athelstan alive to tell the tale. He goes back to camp and tells everyone what happened. And after hearing this, Lear tells his knights to get ready to attack again tomorrow. But after Lear fell asleep, his knights snuck out of the camp and stole everything that he had brought with him. Then they did the same thing the next day and the day after that, until Lear had nothing left to give the knights. And they also started stealing from each other, until the entire army was basically reduced to nothing. With the siege dragging on and his army starving, Lear decided to send a letter to Theodoric begging him to surrender. But when Theodoric heard the letter read aloud, he left. He replied by saying that he would consider giving up the city if Lear could bring him a horse with for bridles, for saddles and for riders who were all color matched. And then after reading that reply, Lear became very ashamed. Meanwhile, on the 36th day of the siege, Athelstan gets into another massive disagreement with Lear. And this time it gets physical. The two of them end up brawling together, and things aren't looking great for Lear. But just as Athelstan is about to kill him, his men pull him off. Realizing that his position is hopeless, Lear flees from the camp and runs into the forest. After he disappears, his men begin to steal from his tents once again, and they also start stealing from Athelstan's camp too, because apparently there weren't enough things to steal already. Athelstan manages to stop the thieving, though, and he punishes the ringleaders by hanging them. As punishment, and soon after that, he just straight up leaves the siege. We don't know exactly why he does this. It could be that he ran out of supplies, or that he was just tired of Lear's complaining, or that he was embarrassed that he couldn't beat a small city, or that he knew that the siege was hopeless so he just cut his losses and went home. Or maybe it was all of those things. In any case, after he leaves, the citizens of Thebes open up the gates and march out to celebrate with Lear. And you would think that this would be the end of the story, but it's actually only the beginning. See, the reason that Athelstan left was because he needed to go back to Northumbria to put down a rebellion. And while he's gone, the Thebans open up the gates and let his army back in. Then they take all of the supplies that the army had brought with them and close the gates once again. At this point, Lear realizes that his only chance of winning the siege is to beg for help from the hermit who lives in the forest nearby. He does this, and the hermit agrees to help him out. The hermit sends his disciples to the cities nearby and asks them to raise an army and meet him at Thebes. Soon enough, an army 5 times larger than Lear's shows up and they easily beat back Aethelstane's men. The Thebans open up the gates again, and this time they invite Lear and his new army to come and sack the city. And when Aethelstane hears about this, he becomes furious and immediately sets out to put Thebes to the torch. Now, up until this point, the story has been pretty brutal. Knights are regularly getting killed, entire armies are getting decimated, and people are just straight up murdering each other. But now the tone shifts and the story ends on a pretty wholesome note. See, when Aethelstane reaches the city, he knocks on the door and asks to speak with Theodoric. When Theodoric opens the door, Aethelstane doesn't burn him or kill him or even curse him. He invites him to come over and see his awesome new army. Theodoric accepts and he brings all of his knights with him. Everyone talks for a bit, and then they all go to church together. And that's the end of the story. So this is the second episode in a row where the good guys lost their siege. And I am starting to wonder if that is just a coincidence or if there is something else going on here. On the surface, it seems like the poem is glorifying these English heroes, but at the same time, it's presenting them as incompetent fools. And I think that's part of the point. John of Fordun was writing for an audience that was well aware of the difference between legend and reality. His audience knew that the Siege of Thebes never actually happened, so they would have gotten a kick out of seeing their national heroes presented as bumbling idiots. In a way, this poem satirizes English history while at the same time glorifying it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and check out my other content. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to get notifications whenever I post.